Hello, learners, and welcome to the sixth lecture in this NPTEL course that surveys the 20th century English novel, but only those by women writers. We have been discussing the life and work of Nella Larsen, and in particular, I have been describing the uniqueness of Nella Larsen's novel Passing. At the end of the previous lecture, I introduced the concept of choice, and I argued that what sets Nella Larsen's novels apart from other novels which also describe racial passing is that the characters in her novels do not need to pass in order to survive. But that itself is a somewhat debatable claim because who decides what are the acceptable conditions in which one should accept a life? Today, we live in a time when it is increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to dictate what someone else should accept as acceptable conditions for their lives. So it is perfectly possible that Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield, the twin protagonists of Nella Larsen's novel, they refuse to accept that simply surviving, right? Simply not being made a slave, right? Simply being free of slavery was good enough a fate for African American people. In fact, it is quite possible to argue that they were empowered by the economic power and the social and financial stability of the newly ascendant Black middle class, and it empowered their ability to discern opportunities and to make choices. Now, the question of choice is also important when we try to understand the difference between questions of race and questions of sexuality. It is very widely known that questions of race, like questions of class, associated with some hard barriers. There are some very hard ceilings. And it's a very natural desire for anyone to try and break free of constraints of race or class. So, for instance, if someone were to say that people of a particular class must be confined to using only particular spaces or particular institutions, and they must be debarred from using certain spaces or certain utilities, then it would be very illegal and it would be an immoral thing to say. And in fact, this is what civil rights was about. The movement against discrimination in early 20th century America was against the law which discriminated against the freedom of African American individuals to use public spaces. In fact, two Supreme Court cases which are very important to understand this novel, Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court said that forcing Black people to use different utilities was not discrimination. And in 1954, when the Supreme Court reversed this decision, and in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, argued that if a Black girl was forced to go to a Black-only school, then it was a violation of her constitutional rights as a US citizen. Between these two court cases, what changed? What changed was that the Supreme Court and American society in general came to accept that confining someone or defining someone's freedoms based on their race was wrong. It was immoral. In other words, it was immoral if we force someone to act in a certain way based on their race. What we are doing then is we are suppressing someone's ability to choose. So what we are instead arguing for, we're saying, and this is what the Supreme Court is allowing the individual in Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court is allowing Brown, the individual from Louisiana, to choose where he would like his daughter to go to school. And this ability to choose, irrespective of what one is born as, whether Brown's daughter is white or Black or Asian, it doesn't matter. She has the right to choose which school she would like to go to. Now, it's important to note that in societies, questions of choice are easier to accept and people find it easier to support the freedom to choose when it comes to matters of race. It also comes easier to choose or accept choice when it comes to matters of class. So, for instance, someone who is born into poverty or someone who is born into wealth, both of them, we would like to argue, have the choice or should have the choice to buy whatever they want. They at least should have the choice to pursue an education and a career of their choice. And they must be allowed this choice. If they are not given this choice, then it is somehow a violation of their fundamental rights as citizens of democratic nations. Now, in matters of race and matters of economic class, choice is easy to accept. In fact, one can even argue that choice is itself a capitalistic concept. That in capitalistic societies, everyone is given the theoretical freedom to choose, but within this freedom of choice, everyone chooses only to make more profits. So it is actually an illusion of choice and not a real choice. No matter this critique of capitalism, we still believe that on a general level, it is easier to accept that everyone should have the choice to do what they want, go where they want, live the kind of life they want, irrespective of the race they were born into, irrespective of the kind of class they were born into. Now, this is true of most societies, and it was true of American society in the early 20th century. However, there is another kind of choice which is less easy for societies to accept, and societies are still struggling a little bit to accept this other kind of choice. This has to do with the choice of one's partner in marriage, or one's life partner, or one's romantic partner. In these cases, societies have been slow to accept, although now it is changing, but in the 20th century, it was very difficult for any society to accept that that also can be a matter of choice. In fact, it was believed very strongly that if a person was born as a man, then they would automatically choose a woman as a partner. Similarly, if a human being was born as a woman, they would choose a man as their romantic or marriage partner. The idea that an individual might exercise the freedom of choice, a pure choice, based on their feelings, their intellectual development, their education, their personality, their creative development, or just about any individual idea they had. This was unthinkable. It was unthinkable or unacceptable that a person would choose their romantic partner based on the sex of their romantic partner based on their individual preference. In the 20th century, this was unthinkable. Today, it is acceptable in some societies, although many societies are still struggling to understand and recognize this kind of choice. So, in the early 20th century American literary sphere, it was very difficult to bring readers to an acceptance of the idea that an individual might choose differently from what society thinks they should choose. So, for instance, women like Irene Redfield and Claire Kendry, they are African American women. That is to say, they are born black. That is to say, that someone in their families, their parents or their grandparents, or someone in the generations before them was of African descent. This is a fact. They are born into this fact. But then the way they live their lives, they do not simply accept this, but rather they make a choice based on their development. Now, in matters of race, the novel describes one kind of choice they make. Claire Kendry decides to pass as white. She chooses to be recognized as a white woman, even though theoretically she has African lineage in her origins. She is able to do this because she has the visible features that people or society accepts as the features of white women. That is, she has blonde hair, she has light skin, fair skin, and her facial features also allow her to be mistakenly recognized as a white woman. Same with Irene Redfield, who does not pass permanently but passes occasionally. That is, when she is with her family, she is accepted as black, but when she travels to certain parts, certain spaces, she decides to be mistakenly recognized as white. So Irene and Claire, the novel describes their choice with regard to their racial identity. And here the novel finds it very easy to say that these two women were born black, but they choose to allow themselves to be mistakenly recognized as white. Now, this choice is accepted because it is considered to be humanly, ethically necessary. Why? Because it was very clear that in the society of that time, advantages and disadvantages were very clearly divided according to racial lines. If Claire decided to be mistaken for white, she could do more things. She would be able to access more opportunities. She would be able to get a better education, more respect in society. She'd be able to find acceptance and love from a white man, marry a white husband, live a better life, more financially stable, materially more comfortable. And she would also ensure that if she were to have children, they would also get those benefits. So, same with Irene. The benefits of economics and material comforts are very obvious. And all readers, including ourselves, we accept that as a human being, these two individuals have the freedom to choose such comforts. If the society is unfair, and if they have the opportunity to escape that unfairness, why would they not escape that unfairness? If they are gifted with some features like fair skin, why would they not? So, this choice is easy to accept. However, there is another choice that these two individuals also, to some extent, attempt to make, and to some extent, actually do make. This choice is in the choice of choosing a romantic partner who is from the same sex. That is to say, both of these women are officially, technically, for all practical purposes, married to male characters, male human beings. But in the friendship, intimacy, and relationship they develop between each other, there is an increasingly subconscious but very powerful degree of attraction. And the novel describes this in very coded terms. The novel never declares openly that there is an attraction or relationship or there's anything beyond mere friendship between these two individuals. But the description of their relationship, and especially the kind of messages they exchange, especially the kind of letter that Claire sends to Irene in the beginning of the novel, and the reaction that Irene has upon reading those letters, it's in the very, very subtle emotions that are described in these words that the novel conveys a very powerful message to its readers. And that message is, it's important to acknowledge that human beings are complex and they often make choices that are very difficult. So that's the first message, that maybe these two women, they are attracted to each other, that they are scared, that they are anxious, and that the real challenge in their lives, that the real secret, that the real burden of anxiety that they are carrying is not that they are passing, but rather that they both carry secret, unarticulated, unfulfilled longings for a person of the same sex. Now, this idea, because it was so controversial and so difficult to write about, remains not very well articulated, but remains only hinted at. In a way, this is a strategy that several writers in the English language used in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a phenomena that the scholar Eve Sedgwick has called the epistemology of the closet. That is, when individuals were forced to keep their identities secret because of the kind of repression that existed in societies, it had an effect, it had a consequence on the kind of writing they produced. It produced a kind of attitude towards friendship. It charged friendships with a degree of emotional and sexual tension. It empowered individuals to do things, to say things and write things that appeared a bit strange to others. And in this case, at its most powerful, at its most successful expression of this intellectual ambition, the novel Passing articulates that racial passing may be less important, or in fact, racial passing may merely be an instrument or tool in the cause of something else, in the cause of describing or making acceptable far more controversial, a far more scandalous and explosive secret. The secret not of someone being from a different race and enjoying the benefits of a different race, but something more scandalous than that, which was the attraction, affinity, tenderness that one African American woman could have for another. In fact, the novel Passing twists the knife, as it were, further and complicates and integrates the question of racial passing with the question of queerness, because it invites readers to think about the consequences of both of these African American women being light skinned and having features that make them resemble white women. The novel states this and asks readers to think about to what extent these features, the fact that these two women who are actually black, theoretically, biologically, genealogically, but who look like white women, end up being attracted to each other. There's a very powerful moment in which Claire Kendry decides to use her charms on Irene, and Irene feels validated, feels a sense of empowerment. And this empowerment has to do with the fact that someone who is perceived as white, that is Claire, Claire who is white for all the people in the society in which they live, is kind and is not only kind but appears to be attracted to and is showering her affections on Irene. So it's a very complicated moment because on one hand, Irene knows that Claire is black, and Claire also knows that Irene is black because they're both born black. But in the society in which they live, Irene sometimes passes for being white, and Claire always permanently passes for being white. So Claire's public image is that of an extremely attractive white woman. And so when Claire decides to shower some of her affection and decides to become extremely friendly and begins to spend more and more time with Irene, the pleasure that Irene gets, the validation that Irene gets, is very clearly related to their race and very specifically related to the kind of desire that African American women had for not white women, but the kind of power and appeal that was publicly attributed to white women in early 20th century America. So it's not that either of these black women who are passing for white is attracted to white women. Rather, both of them betray a very powerful and somewhat embarrassing tendency in early 20th century America, the tendency to associate sexual attractiveness with the features of white femininity. This was something that many African American writers accepted, but found it very difficult to write about. In fact, struggled to come up with the language with which to articulate this. It was difficult because, on one hand, it meant accepting some very deep and some very honest and somewhat less edifying truths about the psychology of human nature. On the other hand, it required a great deal of courage to be able to articulate these ideas and not be perceived as someone who had betrayed the cause of the African American race or the community. So the fear was that if an African American writer would describe features of whiteness or white femininity as being as something that individuals found attractive, then they would be betraying the cause of the negritude movement. As I mentioned earlier, the Harlem Renaissance made it very important and particularly powerful to write about a universal idea of blackness and negritude. The idea was that African American writers must celebrate and affirm the values, the culture, and the aesthetics that came from their essential African identity. And in fact, they must eschew or reject any values, ideas, or aesthetics that seem to align with the interests of the white community. So there was a great deal of fear. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, the novel is not simply about survival of negritude. Rather, it is about choices. And it was being written at a time when the black middle class enjoyed a great deal of economic ascendancy. And I'm going to read two quotes from two scholars which help us understand this. The writer Charles S. Johnson maintained in the essay, The New Frontage on American Life, which was published in the New Negro Anthology. In the 10 years, and this is Johnson, in 10 years between 1915 and 1925, Negroes have actually been transplanted from one culture to another. And the result was this. A new type of Negro is evolving, a city Negro. So this is the key difference. The question of choice becomes extremely important, and choosing is a consequence of economic prosperity. And once economic prosperity is achieved, what kind of choice an individual makes, in fact, detached from questions of racial survival. And it is this very important work, the intellectual labor of making readers accept this very powerful idea that the novel Passing undertakes. Now, I want to say a couple of things about the Supreme Court cases which I mentioned. The first was Plessy versus Ferguson, and the second is Brown versus Board of Education. As I mentioned earlier, Plessy versus Ferguson very powerfully re-entrenched racial discrimination. Basically, the Supreme Court argued that even if a person had features like light skin and other facial features of white people, what really mattered, or what only mattered for the purposes of segregation in society, was the genealogy. So in the case of Homer Plessy argued that he was 1/8 black and 7/8 white, because he was only 1/8 black and he had features like light skin. He should be allowed to have the benefits of white people. The Supreme Court said no. What matters only is genealogy. So even if a person like Homer Plessy had 1/8 black lineage, he or she would be considered black and segregated, and therefore forced to live with the disadvantages that other African American people lived with. Now, this ruling, on one hand, it established the supremacy of race. It said, on one hand, that no matter what appearances looked like, what mattered was genealogy. Birth mattered, not appearance. Theoretically, legally, this was the idea. But in practical terms, in terms of the quality of everyday social life, this ruling in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson had the negative effect. The negative effect was that more and more individuals in African American communities began to pass. Whoever had the opportunity began to take it. Why? Because they realized that there was no escape. There was no other means of surviving. There was no other means of escaping the disadvantages and the discrimination that a white supremacist society had created for black individuals. Now, there are some statistics on how cases of passing increased. And these cases began to increase in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And I'm just going to read a little bit of statistics here. So, numerical estimates vary. The most liberal estimates argue that almost 30,000 individuals per year passed. That is, they were born into black families, but because of their features, light skin, and so on, they were able to pass themselves off as white. A more authoritative and statistically accurate figure is somewhat lower, but as the scholar Walter White pointed out in his 1925 essay in the anthology called The New Negro Anthology, and the essay was titled The Paradox of Color. Walter White argued that we will never know for sure because passing cannot be defined in a quantifiable manner. And if passing means even a single instance in which a person who is technically, that is, on their birth certificate is black, but is able to be identified as white, even if in one instance in their social and professional life, then it counts as passing. And if we take this definition of passing, then the numbers must be extremely large because everyone tried to do this in some way or other. But if one looks only at permanent passers, that is, individuals who permanently establish their identity as white, then the number would be much lower. And so passing represents before the institution of civil rights. That is to say, before the Constitution and the United States government, before they recognized that being born black was not a crime and that being born black entitled individuals to the same freedoms that were guaranteed by the US Constitution. Before the laws were created, the intellectual work on passing and the creative exploratory work that we find in novels like Passing, they helped create the ground. They helped set up an intellectual inquiry into what was the true meaning of race. To what extent could one's appearance determine one's race? So this was a very important idea. Now, there's a quote early in the novel which I would like to read and end this lecture before moving on to a detailed description of the novel in the next one. This is a quote which is spoken from the perspective of Irene. Irene, as I mentioned, is the individual who passes occasionally. Larsen uses free indirect discourse to describe the thoughts of Irene. This is a scene when there are several people. It's a bourgeois gathering. It's a gathering of people who are financially very well off. They are the leisurely class. That is, they don't have to work for a living. They have their financial needs met and are spending time sitting in a restaurant, having a meal and discussing life. So this leisurely class. Irene has a thought while she's sitting in this group. This is her thought. Could that woman somehow know that here before her very eyes, on the roof of the Drayton, sat a Negro? Absurd, impossible. White people were so stupid about such things, for all they usually asserted, that they were able to tell. And by the most ridiculous means, fingernails, palms of hands, shapes of ears, teeth, and other equally silly rot. They always took her for an Italian, a Spaniard, a Mexican, or a gypsy. Never, when she was alone, had they even remotely seemed to suspect that she was a Negro. No, the woman sitting there staring at her couldn't possibly know. So this introduces an idea which I'll discuss in the next lecture, which is that passing is possible not because of the creativity and the resourcefulness and the industrious labor of individuals who try to pass. Yes, they make an effort, but passing is possible because the definition of race itself is so flimsy and absurd. Passing is possible, or rather, white people fail to catch these so-called passers because their own definitions of what counts as whiteness and what counts as blackness is so vague that it would not survive a scrutiny. So Irene here suggests that she has often been mistaken for being Italian, Spaniard, Mexican, or a gypsy. Now, people from these places are known to have somewhat a darker shade of skin, not as pale as that of the typical white American or Western European. And this is because of the history of these regions, because of the miscegenation or the commingling of races from nearby African or Arab regions. So, because whiteness itself is such a hollow construct, it is but natural that passing would take place. Nonetheless, this is one emotional response to passing. The novel will describe several other emotional responses, and we will read a few quotes and also understand what exactly is the intellectual power of these quotes in the next lecture. Thank you.